Listen. Welcome to tonight's pre-Pesach learning, Torah on Tap. And I was thinking about the flow of the seder. No, I was thinking about the flow of the seder and how when we get to the table, we're all excited and we're all paying attention. And, some people want to go a little faster or slower, but like for the most part, I'm with it. And by the end of the meal, I have totally drooped. I am often sleeping at the table, if not totally on the couch. And it's like a real struggle to pull myself back for the end of the seder. I've always been a good sleeper. So like even when I was young, I would fall asleep at the table on someone's shoulder. And so I thought, well, the Afikoman feels like the right time to sort of recenter ourselves after the meal is over. And so like, surely there must be something to it that could inspire me to like wake back up and get back into the seder. So that was my thinking about choosing this topic. And I'm going to share my screen for anyone who would like to see the sources. Now, there's a confusing labeling issue at foot here. So you're going to have to stick with me at the beginning. So when I thought, I want to talk about the Afikoman as a good student, I thought, well, I'll go back to its most original source, which is the Mishnah. And I'll see what it says, and I'll sort of pick and choose what I want to show from there. But I was very confused because when you look at the Mishnah, it says, "Ein maftirin achar haPesach afikomen." You may not conclude after the Paschal Lamb with an afikomen. And so I thought, well, that's confusing because in fact, that is what we do, is we eat an afikomen. And so that feels like weird that we would go against the Mishnah. And in fact, the Gemara has a very similar question, right? The very first thing the Gemara asks is, my afikomen, like what is this afikomen that we're talking about? It's a sort of strange word. It doesn't have a Hebrew or an Aramaic etymology to it. And so there are many different possible answers. So what I'm going to say is for this next 5-minute chunk of this shiur, let's suspend what we know to be our afikomen, which is matzah, and that we do eat it. And let's like imagine that we are rabbis of the Gemara time, and we see in the Mishnah that after they ate the korban, they did not eat an afikomen. So what is that afikomen? So option number one, I promise they'll be relevant to us too, but we're going to have to sort of relabel everything in a moment. So the first option is that there is some idea that of like a progressive dinner happening here. Rav says, "Shelo ya'akru mechavura lechavura," that you shouldn't leave one group to join another group. So one of the basic principles of the Pesach Korban was that you had to eat it in one place with one group of people. And so there is this worry that people were leaving their seder to go see what their neighbor had, or they were stopping off at another friend's on their way home from eating the korban somewhere else. And not only was that a prohibition against the Pesach Korban, but that it would lead to these sort of crazy revelrous parties called, I think, epimezon, right, which comes from Afikoman, and that was like filled with drinking and other sort of wild activities. And so that's what Rav is prohibiting at this moment. So that's option one. Option two, I like because Shmuel is talking about a dessert, but what are his examples of dessert? Kagon or delay, right? Mushrooms or delay for me. Goes laya la Abba, and my friend Abba eats chicks, right? So this is like a very savory dessert. But Shmuel is basically saying you just shouldn't eat anything after. The Korban Pesach is the last meal of of this experience of the seder, and so you should not have any delicacies after the meal, anything extra. And in a sort of similar note, Rav Chanina bar Shela and Rabbi Yochanan say, "Ein maftirin achar haPesach kagon tamarim klayot ve'egozim." That's more of the sort of desserts that we think about having. Right, roasted grains, dates, and nuts, and that so you should not conclude after your seder with those kinds of foods. And in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Talmud Yerushalmi in Pesachim, there's a fourth interesting idea that doesn't really have to do with food at all. Rav Simon b'Shem Rabbi Inai bar Sisei says mine zemer. that it's a kind of singing. And I think that singing, number 4 and number 1 probably go together. It's like you could imagine, like when you see, perhaps if you live on one of these routes, college students walking home from a party, like singing and, staggering arm in arm, and they might see another party going on and they're like, oh, let's stop in there and have a drink there before we go home, right? And so it just sort of adds to that revelry of the moment. So it seems like there are sort of 2 options here, or sort of meta categories. Either the Afikoman has to do with some kind of action, whether it's singing or traveling, or some kind of taste, whether it's savory or sweet, that you should end with the taste of the korban in your mouth. So if we look into the end of Psachim, right, this comes right after here, 19b. Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, achar matzah afikomen, right? He says, well, okay, now we don't have the Pesach korban anymore, so don't worry about that. Just eat matzah in its place, and then don't eat an afikomen after that. So now afikomen means the things you're not supposed to do, right? The food or the action. And the matzah is taking the place of the Korban Pesach. So it's a very confusing labeling issue, and I'm not sure, it's a question I should look into, why we chose to call the matzah that we eat afikomen, since that is the word that was used to describe the things you're not allowed to do in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara. But that's what we do. So the Mishnah Torah helps us sort of helps us out here, and he says, right, that when you finish the Suda, you eat anything you want. And after that, at the end of the meal, you would just consume even just a little bit of the Pesach sacrifice, and that's sort of the last thing you taste. Uvizman hazeh, in our times, or the Rambam's times, ochel kazayit matzah ve'eno toim achar haklum, right? And that's what we do today. We say that you should not taste anything after the afikomen. I remember as a child, like laughing hysterically in my punch-drunk nature about how we couldn't brush our teeth because you didn't want to taste toothpaste, you wanted to taste afikomen in the end of the day. There are some who say that you should do that. Kadei sheyu hafsek sudato v'tam basar hapesach o hamatzah b'fiv she'achlilatan hi hamatzah. Right, he says the consumption of this Pesach sacrifice or the matzah enables us to retain the taste of the meat or the matzah. For eating those portions is the mitzvah. And when I saw this, I thought, like, wow, how often do we just eat that afikomen quickly, or maybe even forget about it altogether if our children have all fallen asleep, right? And this, according to the Mishnah Torah, is actually the mitzvah of the night, is to have this taste, to eat this thing at the end of your meal. So there's clearly something very important about this. So now what we're saying is that we conclude our meal with the matzah, which we call afikomen, and we should not eat anything else after it, which means that, right, in the way of these definitions, we've really sort of stuck to 2 and 3. No dessert after afikomen. And we don't really talk about the behavior patterns as much, generally. Okay, so that's step 1. And there are some intentions that you can say at the beginning of the afikomen. Most of the Haggadot that I had don't have it in there. It just says, now eat the afikomen in English, and then you eat the afikomen. I see my love. But there are some, this is a very long one, and in fact, they don't even translate the whole thing into English, but I thought it was very beautiful. This is from the Breslov Haggadah. And I just like took a picture of the 2 pages here. And the translation that they chose, which I think sums it up nicely: I am fulfilling the mitzvah of eating the afikomen in remembrance of the Paschal lamb, which was eaten at the end of the meal when we were full before midnight. And in fact, that is part of the halacha, is that you should eat your afikomen before the halachic midnight, which is not at 12, but is usually a little bit later by this time of year, because it is meant to take the place. And so I like that idea, first of all, of saying something like this before I eat the afikomen, because I think it helps add that gravity to the mitzvah that the Rambam was talking about. And here, the Breslovers, as good Hasidim, believe that there's sort of the same thing happening above in like the divine world that happens here below in our world. And so they say, let it be considered before you, God, as if we have sacrificed the paschal lamb and eaten it in a holy place to rectify it at its upper source. Somehow, by us sort of pretending that this matzah is a korban, we'll do something up above, and that up above change will cause the holy temple to be rebuilt speedily in our time, and let us merit to bring the sacrifices before you. Now, I love this idea, but I don't pray with such a whole heart for the temple to be rebuilt so that we may merit to bring sacrifices. Certainly, I welcome pushback on that, but I have witnessed before, I think some people heard me talk about the Pesach Sheni for the Samaritans. It's like a gory, really intense experience, and it's not one that I'm particularly interested in. And so I thought, what could it mean to say that we want to focus on the mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach without saying, I wish this was a Korban Pesach? Because although I do, of course, wish that the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt speedily in our time and that Mashiach will come, I hope that the Beit HaMikdash might look a little bit different than it used to. So I think there are sort of two strands that I want to follow to think about what the Afikoman means to us. But if anyone has any thoughts or questions or ideas before we move on. Okay. So option one, sort of building off the Breslov Haggadah, is to say that the Afikoman is something about the values, maybe, of eating the korban or the values of the day. So to do that, I want to look at this. This is a beautiful Haggadah. Rachel asked if I have all these Haggadot. I wish I had left them downstairs. The Lieberman Open Orthodox Haggadah is written by Rabbi Shmuel Hertzfeld. For a while there, he was giving them to like literally anyone who would open their hand because he had just published it. And so Will and I got a copy. It's really beautiful. I highly recommend it. It's not a very expensive one on Amazon. And he is a rabbi in DC. And he walks us through this argument. So I'm going to walk us through most of it, and then we'll read his summation. He notes that the first time we read about the Afikoman in the Haggadah is in the question of the four sons, or the topic of the four sons. And like many, he reminds us that these questions are bizarre, partially because it's hard to talk about labeling problems. What does it mean to be a chacham or a rasha or a tam? And also the answers to the questions that they ask do not always seem to fit. And this is a good example, right? So this is in the Haggadah during Magid, right? The chacham mahu omer, Pesach shahayu avotinu ochli mizman shebeit hamikdash haya kayam al shum ma. He says the Pesach sacrifice that our ancestors were. Oh, I'm so sorry. I jumped the gun. This first part is from Rabban Gamliel's three pieces of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. It's really towards the end, right? You sort of wake yourself back up when you start pointing at things on the table. And so this is to remind us, why do we have a Pesach sacrifice, right? So we have this Pesach that our forefathers used to eat when the temple was alive. For what reason? Al shum shepasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu al batei avotinu b'Mitzrayim, right? Because God passed over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt, as it says, V'amartem zebach pasach hu laHashem asher pasach al batei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim b'nagfo et Mitzrim. Va'et batinu hitzil v'yikod ha'am v'ishtachavu. And so Rabban Gamliel is reminding us that the Pesach sacrifice was an expression of gratitude, right? We all bowed our heads and we bowed our bodies and we thanked God for passing over us. And in that way, I think that there's this really interesting connection between the beginning of Hallel at the beginning of the meal and picking up the Afikoman right before we start Hallel again, right? We eat the Afikoman, we say Birkat Hamazon, and then we say the end of Hallel. And so in some ways, I think the Afikoman is like a bookmark in our seder. Because we put it away, we say the story of Magid, we sing part of Hallel, then we take a long break to eat dinner, and then we eat the matzah to be like, what are we doing here? Oh, right, we're in the middle of thanking God for saving us. That's like the last significant thing that we did before we ate dinner, before we ate maror and all those pieces. And so we want to pick that thread back up, and we want to continue with the matzah. So the matzah is like a bookmark to remind us that we're thankful for this experience. So that's option one. Now, Rabbi Hertzfeld, option two, talking about the four sons, Chacham mahu omer, ma ha'edu v'achukim v'hamishpatim asher tzivah Hashem Elokeinu etchem. Right? The wise son asks this sort of bizarre question, maybe for a wise son. What are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments that the Lord our God commanded you? And the answer seems to have nothing to do with the question, right? You teach him some of the halachot of Pesach. Afikoman. Right? That's the Mishnah that we just read. That you may not eat afikoman after you finish eating the korban. And the Tosefta of Psachim, right, the cutting room floor of what made it into the Mishnah, the things that were left on the ground, reminds us that Chayav Adam Asok B'Hilchot HaPesach Kol Halayla, that the obligation of the seder and of Pesach is to study all evening. And so Rabbi Hertzfeld has, I think, a beautiful explanation for why this answer matches this question. And he says, the answer to the wise son is, you want to know what the laws of Judaism are, right? That's essentially what the Chacham might be asking. Well, the answer is, don't celebrate the holiday of Pesach by going to these Afikoman parties, right? These Afikoman experiences. Instead, focus on studying the word of God and the laws of Torah all evening long. Right. So Rabbi Hertzfeld is following option one of Rav, right? What is the Afikoman? It's these progressive parties that get out of control. And that's not how we celebrate. The reason for singling out Pesach is that our Pesach symbolizes the birth of our nation. Pesach is the holiday in which we celebrate our freedom and our independence. It's our July 4th. Other nations celebrate their freedom with huge, extravagant, and wild parties. We, on the other hand, are told by the Haggadah to act differently. We should not respond to the birth of our nation with an extra long party, but with an extra long study session. We should seize the moment to study God's word all night and understand what it means to be free and what the responsibilities of being an independent nation are. We should respond to the birth of our nation with study and spiritual contemplation, not physical celebrations of our happiness. Right. And so here, I think that when we eat the afikoman, it's a reminder that we just had this big meal and we probably really enjoyed it. Hopefully, if we had good food and nice people to be with, right? For a lot of us, we're seeing family we haven't seen in a long time. But at the end of the meal, we have to pull it back together because it's time to finish the seder just as strong as we started it, right? Is what I hear Rabbi Hertzfeld suggesting. And in fact, Rav Soloveitchik, who is quoted in the Seder night and Exalted Evening, remembers that Rav Chaim would keep the Afikoman at his side during the entire Seder. So he did not allow his children to hide it. And his reason was that the Afikoman represents the Korban Pesach, which, like all sacrifices, becomes disqualified if one is Mesiat Da'at. That is, one's intention is diverted from the korban, right? So there's this idea that if you have a korban, you can't sort of let it leave your mind, let alone your sight. And so Rav Chaim Soloveitchik was actually really keeping that because he wanted it to be a real korban, right? He wanted, I think, to internalize these mitzvot of learning all night, of celebrating our freedom through the korban, of thanking God, and so he really stuck to that methodology. So that's option one, right? Is after the meal where we've had a lot of fun, it's time to pull it back together and remember what we started. Anyone have? I don't want to rush us through. Anyone have questions, thoughts? Looks like, Mark or Kathy, looks like someone's trying to talk. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's really cool and different, totally different than anything I've ever learned. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So the question I was going to ask is about the mitzvah to learn all night, which so I understand the B'nai Brak story, but I never heard that was sort of a mitzvah to do that. So, what are the sources of that? Because I thought it was a very strong point that we need to be done by midnight, which would sort of imply that, okay, we're reveling, but there's an end to it.
So it's a great question. You need to eat your Afikoman by halachic midnight. So there are, some people who, if they get really carried away with the magid or with the meal, right, might have to sort of rush to eat their Afikoman, but you can continue to do your Birkat Hamazon, your Halal, and your Nirtza, the singing portion after halachic midnight. And Will has been to an all-night seder. He felt embarrassed that his Rebbe had not invited me. And I was like, it's okay. I'll go to my aunt's house. It was before we were married. I was happy to miss an all-night seder. What they would do is they would eat the Afikoman and then they would finish their magid wherever they'd sort of left off what they wanted to talk about, the Torah they wanted to share. And then they would go on to bench. So as long as you eat the Afikoman, that's enough. Now, I would say, like, for most people, it's also nice to go to shul the next day, and it's nice to, hear the Torah reading. And, for a lot of people, you can't do both, myself included. And it's not Shavuot, right? It's not the same. This is the Tosefta, right? Which I think is probably important to note. It's not the Mishnah. So it's not entirely our tradition. It does not make it into like the halachic body. But there is an idea that perhaps even if you finish your seder at halachic midnight, that's still a pretty extra long study session for a Pesach night. So I think that that's a part of it. But it's a great question, Kathy. And I think that it's like a little of both. I think it is good to study a lot. There are some people who have the tradition to say Shir Hashirim, the Megillah of Shir Hashirim, after they finish Nirtza. So there are lots of like extra things you could add on at the end of your Seder to make it longer, should you want to. But I do think that there is also a strong tradition not to like push it too far past midnight. And this is also, I would say, like, this is sort of one strain of thinking about what the Afikoman means to us. To Jenny's point, it is not one I had ever learned before either. And, Rachel and I were saying before, there's so many great Haggadot. Like, I have both of these Haggadot, and I have used both of them at Seders in the past. But there's just so much to read. And like, by the time we get to the Afikoman, I'm not reading too carefully anymore. 2 cups of wine and some brisket in, I'm pretty done. So that's one, is to sort of like have a cup of coffee at the end of your dinner and get out your breast love intention and really think about the korban. But I do think there's another way, especially if like korban stuff is not your thing, because the part of the seder, right, when we sing the order of the seder, the part is called tzafun. And tzafun means hidden. So there is possibly something else there, right? Something maybe like a little more Kabbalistic or Hasidic, or something else going on there that's not about the korban itself. So the first thing I wanted to share is a different night Haggadah is a great one. I strongly recommend it. And they have something for everyone. There's a lot of different choices. And here they have a personal meditation for seeking our lost half. And it's much longer. I just put these first few lines. But Pesach is the holiday celebrating our reunion with the lost part of ourselves, right? And even thinking on a sort of more historical, less like, emotional basis, right? We are reuniting our slave selves with the part of us that is our freedom selves, right? Like, I think that that's really accurate in a lot of ways. And that's a really hard reuniting, right? We see all of the like drama that unfolds through the Torah about that, the 40 years in the desert. But on the Seder night, we hide and then seek the Afikoman, reuniting the 2 parts separated at the beginning of the Seder. And so I think we could think about it historically, or we could think about it in some other way, but it's true, right? That we choose to sort of break this apart and hide and then find. And so the intention that they suggest to set is, may we learn to discover the lost parts of ourselves, to become reconciled with relatives who have become distant, and to find wholeness in a Jewish tradition from which we have been alienated. So he covers a lot of ground here, right? It could be about emotional experiences with relatives. It could be about feeling alienated from some piece of our Jewish tradition or our Jewish practice. It could be about just discovering lost parts of ourselves that we haven't thought about in a while, right? Sometimes it's like a little scary to look too deeply into those darker parts of ourselves. And so the Afikoman is actually, you don't have to get back on track to the beginning of the Seder. It's about finishing the Seder with some kind of emotional intention about seeking things that are lost to us. And when you think about the hide and seek piece of it, I think that asking our children to find it brings a special meaning. Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon is an amazing person. I actually do not have this Haggadah. I had to look around for this piece because I heard about it in a podcast. I am thinking about buying it. Don't tell Will because I buy too many books, but it sounds like a great Haggadah. Rav Rimon says here, Rav Rimon is in Israel, a contemporary modern guy. The Afikoman is an expression of redemption. Hiding it is preparation for redemption, right? That I think is amazing, right? When we hide our Afikoman, we're doing it in preparation to find it. What an amazing idea that is, to like hide things so that we may find them. I love that. I think there's like something there. I can't hold it. I can't express it fully, but I think that's beautiful. And it's expressed even at the time of the breaking, which I think is also very poignant, that like breaking and repair all start at the same time, that when something breaks, it's already on the path to being repaired. I think I spoke one Shabbat about kintsusaki, the Japanese form of repair, the gold, where we did a parsha class about it for sure, right? And so that sort of reminds me of this, that like the breaking is already making it more beautiful, making it more whole in some way. Then the custom of hiding the Afikoman and having the children search for it ensures that even if we do not remember the Afikoman at the end of the meal, or that we simply are too tired at that point, the children will come and remind us. So hopefully most people's children are far better behaved than mine and they are not awake. But that is certainly true in my family. My kids have been up for like days by now, and they are totally wired. And as we slack, they are super excited about the Afikoman, right? And I think that's partially why we incentivize the finding of the Afikoman, is to keep our kids awake for us. Because the redemption can sometimes be delayed because of the weariness and waning strength of the traditional adult leadership. At that point, the young ones must come and arouse the adults to act and bring about the redemption. There is no shame in waking up and being refreshed by the vital voices of the children at Seder night and in life itself. So I think that is also such a beautiful point, right? We all get tired. And I was thinking, even if you don't have young children at your Seder, right? My chavruta was saying she's celebrating with college students. Her husband is a rabbi on campus. And they're not going home for any sedarim with nieces or nephews, right? I think that we could read this even about ourselves, right? Sort of a la the first intention, right? Parts of us are tired and maybe jaded or sort of just, feeling done. But there is a part of us that is still young inside, that's still like open and excited and ready to try new things. And we have to somehow let that part of us come out and bring this piece of matzah, this afikoman, this piece of redemption to us. And so whether it's actual children, which I think is beautiful, or an inner part of ourselves, right? There's some kind of lost and found that can only be done by some kind of young energy. We hide the afikoman, encouraging the children to be active partners in what goes on around them. And at the same time, we draw new strength from the power of their youth. So I told Will what I want the kids to do this year is not just to produce the afikoman, but to get their prize, they have to teach us something. They have to tell us some kind of Torah, because I think that that's like a piece of it, right? And again, if your children are not awake at 11:30, kol hakavod, and maybe they could do it at some other point in Pesach, right? But I think that that's like, if that's one of the messages of Pesach, I could totally get behind that our kids' voices matter and that they're important and that they bring something that we actually don't even have inside of us all the time. Will loves to get Afikoman presents, and so he got them like some kind of Lego keychain thingy, because our children will be the ones to rebuild, which is, I think, a very sweet connection to this Torah. Right, so this is the other strand. If we're not into the Korban Pesach Afikoman piece of it, I think we can lean into the tzafun nature of lost and found, of redemption revisited, of appreciating the voices of our young people wherever they are. And either direction that you go, this is another beautiful Haggadah. I really love Haggadahs. I love Pesach. It's one of my favorite holidays. Here, in the night that unites us, Rabbi Aaron Goldschlager reminds us that the last piece of matzah of the night has to be the last taste that we have. so that the seder accompanies us throughout the coming year, right? There's this idea that the seder is not over. And in fact, gosh, I wish Will was down here because his name is escaping me, but the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe was famous for not saying Chasal Seder Pesach, right? Because that is a thing that says, we did it, it's over. And he says, no, it's never over. It's just started, right? The seder lasts throughout the entire year. And I think that's I'm not like a Chabadnik, but I think that's a beautiful, there's a little Chabadnik in me a lot and Will. And I think it's a beautiful idea to say, right, that the Seder accompanies us throughout the year, because on Seder night, God has given us freedom, holiness, joy, and wholeness, right? And I think that that integrates a little bit of both strands, right? The freedom and the holiness come from the Korban side, the joy and the wholeness might come from the tzafun side, and it is our job to hold on to them in the months to come. Everyone thinks that at the end of the Seder, it is all over. They are so mistaken. It's after the Seder that it all begins. And so I think that that idea of keeping that taste, whatever taste we choose to put in our mouths at the end of the Seder, should not only give us energy to finish the Seder strong, but should really be the start of a strong and beautiful new year starting at this point. And so I wish that everyone has a good taste, a holy taste, a joyful taste in their mouth at the end of the Seder and throughout the year to come. And I welcome, of course, discussion, thoughts, ideas. Stop the share so we can see each other. Oh, and I will turn off the recording. So goodbye to everyone on the recording.